It was October 25th, 1984, and inside their family home in Anzhausen, Germany, Günther Stoll, a 35-year-old unemployed food engineer, was watching television with his wife. But his mind wasn't on the show they were watching whatsoever. For months, he had gradually become consumed by paranoia, constantly warning his wife about them, an unspecified group of mysterious people who were stalking him, planning to cause him harm. He was convinced that everywhere he went, this unidentified gang was watching him from a distance, waiting to make their move. Yet no matter how often she asked, he would not tell her who they were or why they were after him. But at approximately 11 p.m. that night, everything changed. Gunther suddenly jumped up from his chair and shouted, "Now I've got it!" His wife sat and watched in confusion as he grabbed a piece of paper and frantically scribbled down 6 letters, YOGTZE. But then, without explaining what he was so excited about, or what YOGTZE even meant, Gunther immediately crossed it out with violent strokes of his pen, and, without another word, abandoned his wife, rushing out of the house, climbing into his Volkswagen Golf and disappearing into the night. This would be the last time his wife saw him alive. Günther Stoll's death and the events that led up to it have become one of Germany's most enduring unsolved mysteries. A mystery that, over the past 40 years, many have tried to solve, but all have failed, until now. 2 months ago, new information from investigators emerged that they say finally answers what really happened to Günther Stoll. Police are so confident in their findings that they have decided to officially close the case. But as you will see, there are multiple pieces of evidence that seem to conflict with their official conclusion, discrepancies that have caused some to suspect that certain pieces of evidence have been swept under the rug. At exactly 3 a.m. on October 26, 1984, 2 truck drivers were speeding along the Autobahn A45 when they spotted something near the Unanswered exit that would haunt them forever. There, beside the road, was a badly damaged Volkswagen Golf that appeared to have crashed into a tree, and as well as what seemed to be the driver moving around outside the car. It should be noted that both truck drivers, independent of one another, would later state during separate interrogations by police that this figure stumbling around near the vehicle was an injured man in a white jacket. But as they approached, the man vanished into the darkness. The 2 truck drivers immediately pulled over, with one rushing to the nearest emergency phone to call for help, while the other went to the wreckage to check for any other survivors. Inside the car, the driver's seat was empty, but in the passenger's seat lay a completely naked, severely wounded, but still conscious man covered in dirt and leaves. When they asked him if he was okay, the man was barely coherent. The accident had clearly disoriented him, yet he was able to tell them something that would become central to the mystery that followed. According to the wounded, naked man, there had been 4 other men in the car with him, and they weren't his friends. But whenever the truck drivers pressed him for more information, the man could only repeat that these other passengers had beat him loose before fleeing the scene. Suddenly, it dawned on them. Perhaps the injured man in the white jacket they had seen before wasn't another victim of the crash, but a potential attacker. With emergency help on the way, the 2 truck drivers did everything they could to keep the man conscious until help arrived, but his injuries were severe and inexplicable. The truck drivers found the entire thing surreal and difficult to comprehend. A naked man bleeding to death in the passenger seat of a crashed car. Speaking of phantom attackers who had somehow vanished without a trace, this was obviously no ordinary traffic accident. When paramedics and police arrived at the scene, the man was still conscious and alive. They had an opportunity to get as much information out of him as possible, but the man was still completely out of it. He seemed to be in shock from the trauma, slowly dying in front of their eyes. He couldn't offer them anything valuable other than the repeated claims about the 4 mysterious men who had been with him, and his own name, Günther Stoll. But as the police desperately tried to jog his memory for something, anything, the medical team was struggling to keep him awake. Günther Stoll died on the way to the hospital, his injuries too severe to overcome. The police had gotten nothing from him, but they still had the crime scene, untouched since the trucker's discovery. As the police began processing the crash site, they uncovered evidence that transformed what seemed like a simple but brutal accident into something far more sinister. For instance, according to them, the pattern of damage to the vehicle didn't match Gunther's injuries. Forensic investigators on the scene quickly concluded that Gunther's fatal injuries had not been sustained in the car crash at all. The physical evidence simply didn't match up. Gunther's car keys had been removed from the ignition and placed on the rear shelf of the vehicle. His shoes were neatly placed on the floor of the driver's seat, despite the violence of the crash. And most puzzling of all, Gunther's naked body was covered in dirt and leaves, suggesting he had been lying on the ground somewhere in a wooded area before he was in the car. In the eyes of the investigators, Gunther hadn't been physically beaten by a gang of people, as he had claimed. The evidence suggested that Gunther had been hit by another vehicle while naked, then somehow transported to his own car and positioned in the passenger seat. His car was then driven to this location by another person who crashed it. In their eyes, this so-called accident was quite possibly an elaborate staging designed to conceal what appeared to be murder. But that conclusion didn't solve anything, really. It only presented more questions. Who had driven Gunther's car to this location? Where had he actually been injured and why? And who were the 4 men he claimed had been with him? To understand what happened that night, investigators would have to delve deeper into who Günther Stoll was and what had led him to this moment. Günther Stoll lived a quiet, unremarkable life in a small village in Anzhausen, Westphalia, then part of West Germany, with his wife and daughter. Throughout 1984, he had been struggling with unemployment, unable to find work as a food engineer. But to those who encountered him during day-to-day life, he seemed to be a perfectly content family man. But those close to Günther knew that beneath the surface, something was deeply wrong. For several months leading up to his death, he had apparently been displaying increasingly severe symptoms of paranoia. He would speak obsessively to his wife about them, mysterious, unnamed people who he was convinced were following him and planning to harm him. When pressed for details about who they were or why they would want to hurt him, Günther could never provide specifics. If anything, he would become increasingly vague. Günther's wife was happy to cooperate with the investigation, offering up crucial testimony about her husband and his final evening. The only problem is that her account of what happened ended up raising as many questions as it answered. She described how her husband had been acting typically paranoid on the night of his death, once again mentioning his fears about them. He didn't seem to be able to focus on anything but this now completely overwhelming conviction that they were coming for him. In her description, his typical paranoia was suddenly interrupted by his experiencing what appeared to be a moment of revelation. According to her, his sudden yell of, "Now I've got it," seemed to come from nowhere. There had been no phone call, no visitor, and seemingly no trigger in his immediate environment to inspire this epiphany. One moment he was sitting quietly, the next, he was frantically writing something on a piece of paper before crossing it out and rushing from the house without even bothering to tell her where he was going. But here's what started to confuse the authorities. Even though she watched him have his inexplicable epiphany and leave the house late at night without warning, she hadn't been concerned about his mental state, what he would do, or even where he was going. His erratic behavior had become so common and unexpected over the past few months that she had just grown accustomed to his sudden departures and strange ramblings. She had no way of knowing that this time would be different, that her husband would never return home. Now she was trapped in an agonizing limbo, wondering if her husband may well have been right, that someone had been out to get him, and now she may never know for sure. Günther's professional background as a food engineer was one of the only other things about his past that investigators could really explore. Was it possible that he could have been the victim of some kind of industrial espionage? Did he know something that he shouldn't? Given his otherwise normal family life and quiet existence, it seemed impossible to imagine he would have been willingly involved in a life of crime. Investigators considered that Günther may have stumbled upon something in his work that made him a target. But his other personal habits were also unusual. Despite being unemployed, Günther would make regular holiday trips to the Netherlands, with no clear indication of where the money necessary to fund the travel was coming from. In the 1980s, the Netherlands was notorious for its drug trade, so it makes sense that the investigators would suspect that such a quiet, unassuming man may actually have been involved in some kind of trafficking ring. Yet he had no criminal record, no apparent connections to any criminal organizations, and his family were convinced that he wouldn't have done something so dangerous. Günther's friends and family painted the picture of a man who was fundamentally good, but who had become increasingly anxious and jumpy in the months before his death. The paranoia had become all-consuming, affecting his relationships and his ability to function as a normal member of society. Yet, Despite his mental state, those who knew him insisted that Gunther was not the type of person to fabricate elaborate stories or seek attention through dramatic gestures, that whatever he claimed had been happening must have been truly what he believed. With still very little to go on, investigators painstakingly reconstructed Gunther's movements on his final night, creating the only timeline they could piece together. However, they discovered huge gaps in time and unexplained behavior that muddied the waters even more. After leaving his house at around 11 p.m., Gunther drove to his favorite pub, the Papillon in Wilnsdorf. Witnesses at the pub confirmed that he came in, ordered a beer, and sat down at the bar. But then, before he could take even a single sip, something unexpected happened. He suddenly collapsed, falling backward off his stool and smashing his face on the floor. When the locals helped him to his feet, they found that his injuries were severe enough to cause bleeding and leave visible marks. Most importantly, witnesses were adamant that Gunther had not been drinking and showed no signs of intoxication when he entered the establishment. He was sober. So what happened? When Gunther regained consciousness a short time later, he appeared disoriented, but was able to walk. He told the concerned locals that he merely had a blackout, but wasn't drunk. They gave him an orange juice and a shot of schnapps, but Gunther quickly left the pub and got back into his Volkswagen Golf without talking to a single person. But what happened next remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. For almost 2 hours, from approximately 11:30 p.m. until 1 a.m., Günther Stoll's whereabouts are a complete mystery. It's as if he just vanished entirely during this critical window, encountering no one, stopping nowhere, and leaving no trace of where he went and what he might have been doing. At 1 a.m., Gunther reappeared in Hagersilbach, the town where he had grown up, which is roughly a 15-minute drive from Anzhausen, the town he lived in at the time. According to witness statements, he went to the home of a woman he had known since childhood, knocking on her door in the middle of the night. The woman, disturbed by the late hour and Gunther's obviously agitated state, refused to let him inside, but he had something to tell her. On their doorstep, they had a brief conversation, and that's when Gunther told the woman those uncomfortable words. "Something horrible is going to happen tonight." It's hard to know what this woman thought he meant, whether she thought he was worried about himself or if he was making a veiled threat towards her. But when she suggested he go to his parents' house nearby or return home to his wife, Gunther insisted that they wouldn't understand him. To Gunther, this woman alone was the only person on the planet who would listen to his worries and get it. However, her concerns for her own safety made her push for him to leave, advising him to go home to his family. This was the last confirmed sighting of Günther Stoll before being found naked and on the verge of death in the passenger seat of his crashed car on the Autobahn A45. But let's just remind ourselves of this bizarre route that Gunther took, because it truly makes no sense. Anzhausen to Hagersilbach is a 15-minute drive south, yet Gunther was missing for almost 2 hours before he showed up there, so he couldn't possibly have driven straight there. He must have gone somewhere in between. From Hagersilbach, he drives back north, almost toward his home, but somehow he ends up at the Hagensud exit where he ultimately dies. And look at this, that exit is an hour away from Hagersilbach, and yet he took 2 hours to get there. These gaps in the timeline are critical because they pretty much confirm that something happened. If he wanted to just get to his destination, it was basically a straight shot in the middle of the night with much less traffic than you'd see in the day. Where he was going, what happened during those missing gaps, and who, if anyone, was with him, those questions were nowhere close to being solved. Then, 6 months after Günther Stoll's mysterious death, his wife finally came forward with information that would transform this strange case into one of Germany's most famous unsolved mysteries. She told police about the note her husband had written on his final night, the cryptic letters, YOGTZE, that he had scribbled down before aggressively crossing them out and leaving the house without any effort to explain. It was crucial information, yet she had inexplicably decided to withhold it until this exact moment. But there was a much bigger problem than just the timing. The note no longer existed. Gunther's wife admitted that she had thrown it away later that night, before she knew about her husband's death, convinced it was just another one of his bizarre meltdowns. This meant that the police, and the rest of us, had only her memory to rely on for the exact spelling and contents of what would arguably become the case's most famous piece of evidence. Obviously, the lack of a physical note raised major questions about its authenticity, Why would Gunther's wife throw away a note that her husband had written in such a dramatic fashion? In her police interview, she had specifically pointed out how unusual it was for him to have an epiphany like this, how he had never done it before. So if she thought it was important enough to tell police about 6 months later, why hadn't she preserved it? Well, for some investigators, this made them wonder if the note had ever existed at all. Yes, it's entirely plausible that she may have simply forgotten about it in her shock and grief, but these experts had dealt with many cases, and often there was another reason for a delay like this. The one thing that everybody agreed on was that this note, this bizarre code, if it was real, might be the key to solving the case. Or it might be a total red herring, but they needed more eyes on it to be sure. Linguistic experts and cryptographers were brought in from around Europe to analyze the word YOGTZE and find some kind of meaning in it, but their efforts proved fruitless. The combination of letters matched no known language, code, or cipher system. Then, in April 1985, the YOGTZE case was featured on Aktenzeichen XY ungelöst, or Case Number XY, Unsolved, Germany's most popular television program dedicated to unsolved crimes. The show, which had been surprisingly productive and instrumental in solving numerous unsolved cases since its debut in 1967, presented a detailed reenactment of what was known from Gunther's final hours and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his death, bringing it to the attention of a wider audience throughout the nation. The broadcast had an immediate impact, generating hundreds of tips from viewers across Germany, many of them focusing on two key elements: the mysterious man in the white jacket seen near Gunther's crashed car, and possible explanations for the meaning of YOGTZE. Reports were flooding in, with viewers claiming to have seen a hitchhiker dressed in a white jacket near the Hagensuit exit around the time of Gunther's death. If they were legitimate reports, these sightings would corroborate the two truck drivers' testimonies about that mysterious figure lurking around the vehicle. Unfortunately, despite extensive follow-up investigations, this person was never located or identified. But that code, the mysterious YOGTZE, that really got the public's imagination firing up. After just one broadcast, a wave of amateur cryptographers and mystery theorists proposed dozens of different interpretations for the YOGTZE code, hoping to be the one to crack the case. The show's format, which encouraged viewer participation and speculation, helped transform the case from a local mystery into an international obsession that continues to this day. So, what is YOGTZE? Over the decades, investigators and amateur detectives have crafted their own theories about the meaning of the cryptic YOGTZE message. Some of them have potential, others not so much. One of the most common theories was actually submitted in response to the television broadcast. Amateur radio enthusiasts took one look at that code and instantly believed that it was some kind of radio call sign. In their eyes, the G was not actually a G, but a slightly misshapen 6. YO6TZE would, in theory, give them an actual radio call sign to listen to, and maybe then there would be clarity. It was a theory that actually seemed plausible. Investigators started bringing these radio experts in to try and locate the alleged broadcast, which turned out to be a lot farther than they expected. You see, back in the 1980s, YO was the prefix for Romanian radio stations, and the 6 would be the specific station identifier. But what they found gave them absolutely no information, potentially some good tunes, but sadly no leads. There was simply no clear connection between Gunther and Romanian radio, and many had doubts that the G was a 6, so the theory was quickly dismissed. Another popular theory suggested that YOGTZE represented a license plate number that Gunther had observed. Perhaps Gunther's paranoia had in part come from witnessing something he shouldn't have, or something he felt uneasy about, like a crime. Did that moment of sudden realization come from him remembering the license plate number of murderous criminals? The fact that he crossed out the letters as soon as he wrote them could indicate that he realized he made an error in writing the number down, or that he simply understood the dangers of possessing such information. Did he know that someone was going to harm him because of what he knew? Or was it something more, well, fantastical? I'm going to be honest and tell you that not all of the theories were that coherent. In fact, many of them were really out there. But given that we know basically nothing about what went down that night, I suppose we can't rule out anything. There was a surprisingly popular theory among investigators that YOGTZE was not actually a word in itself, but an anagram. Given Gunther's background as a food engineer, they came to wonder if YOGTZE was related to his profession. After all, just a little bit of rearranging would give you zygote. a biological term referring to the earliest stage of development in multicellular organisms. I know, none of that sounds very out there. It's actually just science. But while the investigators were trying to find its underlying meaning, some people took it and ran, coming to believe that Gunther might have discovered something related to genetic modification in food production, that he discovered a toxic ingredient or otherwise illegal act that essentially blacklisted him from finding work and potentially made him a target for corporate interests seeking to protect trade secrets. Now, if that's a little too plausible for you, there were others. Military conspiracy theorists suggested that YOGTZE could be a NATO phonetic alphabet code or military designation, which is a pretty random suggestion with no real basis in the case at all. Why would Gunther feel the need to speak in NATO code? He worked in the food industry. Besides, extensive research by military experts pretty much failed to identify any NATO codes or operations that match this combination of letters. Otherwise, we pretty much get all of the same theories that all mysteries get. Some believe it was a coded reference to a secret society, a stock market manipulation scheme, or, of course, aliens. Others believe that the letters should be read upside down, revealing an entirely different message. That somehow makes even less sense, actually. As investigators delved deeper into the YOGTZE mystery, fundamental questions arose about whether the note had ever existed at all. The fact that only Gunther's wife had seen it, combined with her 6-month delay in reporting it to the police, raised legitimate concerns about the reliability of this crucial piece of evidence. For all we know, she misremembered or made the whole thing up. But that leads us to a whole other question, and one that could change the entire approach of the investigation. If Gunther's wife had fabricated the story of the note, what could her motivation have been? What would she have to gain from misleading the investigation like this? Here's where things get interesting. Obviously, there are those who believe that Gunther's wife had something to do with his death, and this whole story she created was a way to throw them off the scent. But let's be honest, that's a pretty straightforward explanation for such a complex and bizarre mystery. Investigators did consider it at first, but they couldn't find any motive for her to want her husband dead, which leads us to a second possibility, that she may have made up YOGTZE as a way to keep her husband's case in the public eye. Think about this. When the news covers a tragic death, it's usually out of the media within a few days. But when the news covers a tragic death that has a mysterious aspect, like, say, a coded message, the case never truly dies. There will always be investigators trying to crack the case. Just look at the Zodiac Killer. Nothing but a disturbed narcissist who took pleasure in the suffering of others and was desperate for attention. And people have given it to him for over half a century, all because he gave them little coded puzzles to solve. So, did YOGTZE ever exist? Many think not, and perhaps it was conceived purely to keep the case alive. That, or she was telling the truth. If she was telling the truth, then all of this becomes even more complicated, because neither the investigators nor the rest of us know if her memory of the note was distorted. Trauma and grief can significantly affect memory formation and recall. 6 months after the traumatic loss of her husband, could she accurately remember exactly what he had written? The human mind often seeks patterns and meaning in random events, particularly during times of extreme stress. Was she doing that? Was she trying to make sense out of this senseless tragedy? It's possible, but if everything about the YOGTZE note was genuine, Gunther's decision to cross it out immediately after writing it remains a completely inexplicable mystery. Okay, maybe he realized he made an error in what he was writing and decided to scratch it out. I guess that makes sense. Or perhaps Gunther knew that possessing such information was dangerous, but only realized it after writing it down. After all, nobody in their right mind writes something down just to immediately destroy it. If you didn't want anybody else to have it, you just wouldn't write it down. But then again, it's quite possible he wasn't in his right mind. So here's the problem. Because Gunther was going through very well-documented paranoia and mental health difficulties, there's a possibility that everything we have to go off of is meaningless. Paranoid individuals, not unlike people who are grieving, can perceive significance in random letters, numbers, or patterns that have none. And Gunther's deteriorating mental state could have led him to believe that the meaningless characters of YOGTZE held profound importance. To put it more simply, he wanted an answer to his paranoia, so he may have just invented one. So, maybe he was just in the throes of psychosis, but does that explain all of the other weirdness that went on that night? Mental health professionals who have examined the YOGTZE case have argued that it does, that all of Gunther's behavior can be explained by a severe psychotic episode. His months of increasing paranoia, his belief that unnamed enemies were pursuing him, and his erratic behavior on the night of his death all align with the symptoms of acute psychosis. Even if we look at his sudden yell of, "Now I've got it," this is something that mental health experts would describe as a moment of false clarity, a common side effect. When they slip into this state, individuals often believe they have suddenly understood a complex conspiracy or solved a major mystery, when in reality, their thoughts are disordered and illogical. The YOGTZE note, if it existed, could simply be the meaningless product of a confused mind seeking patterns where none existed. This theory also explains Gunther's other strange behavior. His collapse at the pub possibly being a panic attack triggered by his deteriorating mental state, his multiple unexplained 2-hour disappearances possibly involving aimless wandering and removing his clothes, and his final appearance at his childhood friend's house, babbling about impending doom. All of this fits the pattern of someone experiencing a severe psychotic break. Many are convinced that Gunther's death isn't actually that much of a mystery, but a tragic accident involving a mentally ill man who, in his confused state, may have wandered onto a road and been struck by a vehicle. The driver, panicked about hitting a naked, obviously disturbed individual, might have made the poor decision to move the body to avoid legal consequences and instead ended up creating one of Europe's most notable unsolved cases. The only problem with this theory is the evidence that seems to suggest this wasn't an accident at all, but murder. The physical evidence seemed to investigators at the scene to tell a clear story of deliberate violence and careful staging designed to conceal the true cause of death. When they got to the scene and collected all of their forensic evidence, investigators developed a detailed theory about how Gunther's murder might have unfolded. They believed that sometime during his missing 2 hours, Gunther encountered his killers, the 4 men he mentioned to the truck drivers. Those individuals somehow lured or forced him to a remote location where he was stripped naked and run down by a vehicle. The murderers then transported Gunther's unconscious but still living body to his own car, positioned him in the passenger seat, and drove the vehicle to the crash site near the Autobahn A45. One of the perpetrators then crashed the car into the tree, either accidentally or purposefully to create the appearance of a traffic accident. And the man in the white jacket seen by the truck drivers was one of the attackers, fleeing the scene after staging the crash. Let me just remind you that, in 1985, this was the investigators' primary working theory. This was the only theory that explained several pieces of evidence. Gunther's injuries were consistent with being run over rather than being injured in a car crash. His naked state suggested he had been stripped, possibly to remove forensic evidence. The positioning of his body in the passenger seat made sense if he hadn't been driving and had been placed there by others. The presence of dirt and leaves on his body also supported the theory that he had been ran over at another location. This theory had all of the evidence, a credible cause of death. The only thing they didn't have was a clear motive. Gunther's background as a food engineer led to speculation about industrial espionage, that maybe he had discovered proprietary information that made him a target by his former employers. But that feels kind of silly and extremely reckless on the part of the supported company. His trips to the Netherlands were initially suspected of having drug connections, though this theory was eventually discounted because, to put it bluntly, they couldn't find any connection to any known drug dealers. Other theories focused on the mysterious them that Gunther had been afraid of. If his paranoia was based in reality rather than mental illness, these unknown enemies might have finally acted on their threats. The YOGTZE note, if genuine, could have been evidence of what Gunther had discovered about these people. But the murder theory required explaining why the killers would go to such elaborate lengths to stage an accident. Professional criminals might have wanted to avoid a murder investigation, knowing that accidental deaths receive less scrutiny than obvious homicides. But without a motive, none of that meant anything. And ultimately, the investigation was running out of steam. Their victim was dead. Their suspects were giant question marks. The evidence could be interpreted multiple ways, and witnesses were unreliable. The truth, it seemed, was nowhere in sight. By the late 1980s, the YOGTZE case had exhausted basically all of its investigative leads. Despite following over 1,200 tips generated by the television broadcast and other publicity over the years, police have been unable to identify the mysterious man Gunther claimed had been with him. The man in the white jacket remained unidentified, and no physical evidence directly linked any suspect to the crime. The case was officially classified as an unsolved murder, but investigators never gave up hope. Evidence from the scene was carefully preserved, including samples of DNA that had been recovered from Gunther's car. In 1984, advanced forensic techniques were still in their infancy, but investigators hoped that future technological developments might provide new avenues for solving the case. Each year, prosecutors would review the case file looking for new approaches or overlooked evidence in hopes of cracking it. Amateur investigators continued to propose new theories about the meaning of the cryptic note and the identity of Gunther's alleged killers. But despite the case's high profile in German media, nothing new of significance came. However, investigators remained optimistic that eventually someone with crucial information would come forward, or that advances in DNA analysis would provide the breakthrough they needed. And according to them, they were right. In April 2025, after more than 40 years since the beginning of the investigation, German police announced that the YOGTZE case had finally been solved. But their conclusion was not what many were expecting. After conducting new forensic analyses and re-examining all available evidence, investigators reportedly came to the conclusion that Günther Stoll's death was not murder after all, but a tragic accident involving a man suffering from severe mental illness. The supposed breakthrough came through advanced DNA analysis of evidence preserved from the original crime scene. Using modern techniques that were unavailable in 1984, forensic scientists failed to find DNA from any unknown individuals in Gunther's car. In their minds, it ruled out the long-held theory that multiple people had been involved in moving his body. Which is bizarre, because to just about everybody who witnessed the scene in person, it seemed extremely obvious that he had been moved. Yet the clean DNA profile suggested that only Gunther himself had been in the vehicle. But to support this conclusion further, modern forensic pathology techniques allowed investigators to re-examine the evidence about Gunther's injuries. While the original autopsy had determined that his wounds were inconsistent with the car crash, new analysis suggested that the injuries could have resulted from the vehicle impact and the way that he was positioned inside the car. Based on this evidence, investigators concluded that Gunther had been driving alone when his mental state deteriorated to the point of a complete psychotic break. In his confused condition, he likely removed his clothing, which, admittedly, is a behavior sometimes seen in individuals experiencing severe psychiatric episodes. He then lost control of his vehicle, crashing into the tree beside the highway. The force of the impact then threw Gunther from the driver's seat to the passenger seat, and his claims about 4 men being with him have been dismissed as hallucinations brought on by severe head trauma and pre-existing mental illness. Case closed. For some. For others, even in light of the case's closure and DNA evidence, the case remains unresolved. It is paramount that we respect the official report and the work that went into it. But in the interest of hearing out all sides, let's discuss the parts of this mystery that some feel are still unanswered. The first being both truck drivers, who didn't know one another, independently reporting seeing an injured man in a white jacket near Gunther's crashed car. They gave identical descriptions despite being questioned separately and having no opportunity to coordinate their stories. Could they have seen another motorist who had stopped to help but fled when emergency services arrived? Potentially. Some wonder about where their car was, what reason they would have to flee the scene, since nobody would have suspected their involvement in a one-car crash, and why they might have been injured. Then there's the location of Gunther's car keys. The keys were found on the rear shelf of the vehicle, having been removed from the ignition. The original investigation's conclusion was that someone else involved in the incident put them there. The new official conclusion would suggest that Gunther removed them and put them there himself. But some are wondering how. The keys would have remained in the ignition unless it was turned off, and then the keys were specifically removed. So after the crash and being thrown into the passenger seat, did the mortally wounded Gunther muster up the last of his strength to reach over, turn off the engine, and remove the keys from the ignition, only to throw them in the back of the car where they landed perfectly on the shelf? Perhaps. But then again, let's consider the possibility that Gunther, in his extremely erratic and delusional but uninjured state, decided to turn off the engine and remove the keys from the ignition while driving on the Autobahn. From some research into how most old cars work, it seems this is doable, but that it would result in the steering wheel locking. Which, interestingly enough, if that's true, it would actually explain why Gunther went off the road and crashed. But then again, how did the keys end up on the back shelf? The new investigator's conclusion says the momentum from the crash sent his body flying sideways into the passenger seat, which has led some to wonder why that sideways momentum would send the keys flying backwards onto the shelf. Is it possible that, after taking them out of the ignition while driving, Gunther threw the keys behind him in the moments right before the crash and they landed perfectly on the shelf and then stayed there throughout the crash? Then there's the positioning of his shoes, which were found neatly placed on the floor of the driver's seat. To some, it seems implausible that if the impact was severe enough to move a human body over an entire seat, that a pair of shoes would remain in a tidy little arrangement on the floor. Admittedly, it's understandable and in some ways compelling to consider there's more going on here. But then again, the results could just as easily demonstrate the principle of Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is often the correct one. What do you think of the case? Let us know in the comments below. Perhaps the truth about Günther Stoll's death lies somewhere in between the extremes of murder conspiracy and tragic accident. Or maybe he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what is clear is that Günther Stoll was a man who, whether it was due to mysterious men or just his mental health, was in danger and needed help, but was ignored. A man whose final hours were probably just as confusing and illogical for him as they continue to be for us. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel, as it really helps us to keep making more stories for you. Like this one, about a man who successfully kept his identity a secret from the police. That was until Reddit solved the case 17 years after his death. Click the video on your screen now to watch.